Welcome back to Biographics. I'm your host, cosmic horror author Eric Malachite, and today's script was provided by James CJ, so be sure to show him some love in the comments while you deploy your likes, subscribe to the channel if you're not, and share this video with someone who loves learning about historical figures. And before we get started, I want you to name drop your favorite female authors. I've got two for you, S.E. Jensen and Lee Grissom, two fantastic cyberpunk authors that you need to check out. Anyway, let's get to it. Despite Jane Austen passing away in 1817, the following centuries began to result in an undeniable legacy. Over time, her body of work has become revered as some of the best works in literary fiction. But during her lifetime, there was little fanfare or recognition for Austen's work and talent. Before she became a legend, she was simply Jane. Her life is far from remarkable and not well documented. If anything, the information we have tells the story of a relatively simple, calm, and steady life. The life of Jane Austen, the legend, is a puzzle that is not easy to solve. She left no autobiographical notes, and most of the letters she wrote to her numerous siblings and extended family didn't survive. However, over the centuries, fragments of information have been unearthed, allowing us to piece together a compelling account of her life despite the gaps. This is what we know about one of history's most revered authors. On December 16, 1775, during a harsh winter in the Hampshire village of Steventon, George and Cassandra Austen welcomed their seventh child into the world, Jane. Her father, an Anglican rector who is a cleric acting as an administrative leader for their Christian denomination, christened his newborn daughter immediately before she spent months with her mother on bed rest. It was after about 3 months that Cassandra handed her newborn over to a woman in the village who would handle Jane's early adolescence. As was the case with the other Austen children, Jane would spend between a year and 18 months in the care of a stranger until she was deemed old enough to be easily managed at home. This was far from an uncommon practice in a time when motherhood was extremely different from the parenting techniques of the modern era. In the 18th century, the concept of bonding with a child, especially in their earliest years, was far from necessary. Of course, it's unclear how this affected the kids, like Jane. It clearly had some effect, though, as evidence is littered throughout Austen's work, portraying a level of emotional distance between mother and child, but nothing definitive can be claimed in the matter. One thing that made the Austen family different from many others in 18th century Britain was the fact that their family of 7 children all grew up healthy and none perished, which was a rather uncommon occurrence of the century, considering over half the children born in London at the time usually died before reaching the age of 5. This fate seemed to elude the Austen family. Of course, not all aspects of their lives enjoyed the same kind of luck. George Austen as a provider was inadequate. He was constantly paying off old debts with new debts in a vicious cycle, never having enough to pay the bills and feed such a large family. Beyond his work as an Anglican rector, he farmed and taught boys who boarded at the Austens' home. They may not have been a wealthy family, but they survived. In terms of education, Jane was sent to Oxford with her sister, also named Cassandra, in 1783. During this time, both Austen girls were sent back home during autumn after they both came down with a case of typhus, which nearly claimed the life of Jane. As a result of this unfortunate illness, Jane was homeschooled until 1785 when she started attending the Reading Abbey's girls' school with her sister. This didn't last long either due to the high cost of school fees, and both returned in December 1786. But despite this, Austen managed to get a decent education, largely thanks to her love of reading. With access to a fair amount of books from her father's collection and that of a family friend, she could learn while filling in gaps by using her brother's school books. Around this time, she began experimenting with writing with the blessing of her father, who curiously encouraged it. Culturally, she was exposed to numerous plays staged in the village, most of which were comedies that might provide insight into Jane's known wit. At age 12, Austen wrote 3 short plays of her own. It was clear she had a passion for writing, but nobody was aware of just how gifted she truly was with words. Every great writer starts somewhere, and for Jane, she started at a very young age. Writing several short plays at the age of 12 kickstarted an early love of writing and crafting stories. In her earliest years as a writer, Austen wrote numerous poems and short stories meant to amuse herself and her family. Much of Austen's style that we know and love was present in her early works, of course. It was refined throughout her teenage years before she began working on the novels that we celebrate today. These years, from 1787 to 1793, from ages 12 to 18, Austen's work is referred to as the Juvenilia. In total, the Juvenilia contains 90,000 words spread across 3 volumes. Scholars often refer to the work found in these volumes as anarchic and boisterous. Some of her early works employed the efforts of her sister Cassandra, who was gifted as an artist. For example, Jane Austen wrote a satirical parody of the history of England by Oliver Goldsmith, featuring several portraits provided by Cassandra. During this period of the Juvenilia, Austen decided she wanted to write for profit, but more importantly, she wanted to write. At the tail end of Austen's adolescence, she'd begin working on Lady Susan, her first true short novel and one written as an epistolary piece, meaning told in the form of letters between characters. Despite working on it between 1793 and 1795, from ages 18 to 21, the novel didn't get published until 1871, long after Austen's death. Regardless of its publication status in 1795, it was the project that shaped the young writer who was about to begin writing her first novel, which ended up serving as the earliest incarnation of a true classic, Pride and Prejudice. But that was still a story Jane was far from telling. In all of Jane's 41 years alive, she never married, but that doesn't mean that she never fell in love. Well, actually, it's unclear what true feelings she felt for Tom Lefroy. The fact that we even know of Tom Lefroy is thanks to a surviving letter Austen sent to her sister Cassandra, where she talks of meeting Lefroy at a ball. The relationship between the two is dated to have possibly started when Lefroy was visiting Steventon from Ireland and on his way to London, where he'd be training to be a barrister in December 1795. At the time, both Austen and Lefroy were like 20. The first letter to her sister that mentions Tom seems to make no effort at concealing Jane's feelings for him, which are clearly the makings of infatuation and attraction. For 2 months, from December 1795 to January 1796, Austen wrote letters to Cassandra laying out her feelings for Lefroy. In some, it seemed as if she'd be willing to marry Tom and live in Ireland raising kids. However, other letters seemed almost the opposite. It's possible that Austen struggled with the idea of following the traditional route of being a mother and housewife and had internal struggles with it her entire life. Tom Lefroy is interesting not because of who he was as a person, but more the idea of what he brought to Austen's life. Regardless of how their relationship might have actually been, from the existing letter, there's a clear example of something that doesn't happen often, at least to our knowledge, about Austen's letter writing. She's writing herself as the heroine. Instead of writing a romantic story, she was experiencing one and grasping at the excitement and adventure of attraction and romance. To the extent that this romance existed is largely up for debate, and we'll never really know the answer. Lefroy, in his later years, stated he'd once loved Jane Austen in a boyish love. The evidence we have of Jane Austen and Tom Lefroy's romance is incomplete and hard to interpret when the author of the evidence is the satirical Jane Austen. But by all measures, this is one of the only times Jane Austen may have known what it felt like to exist in one of her own stories. In the end, however, Jane and Tom weren't meant to be. Both were penniless and Tom was being supported by his uncle, so in Lefroy's eyes, it was never going to happen. It is a brief chapter in Austen's life, lasting only a few months, but how much it impacts the story she told and how she told them is both undeniable and unquantifiable. Mr. Austen took Jane's writing seriously, believing she was both talented at it and perhaps destined to do it. On her 19th birthday in 1794, he bought her a stunning mahogany writing desk, which she used to write and to hold early drafts of some of her most important manuscripts. The timeline of Jane completing her first manuscript remains a bit confusing, but to the best understanding we have, after completing Lady Susan in 1795, Austen began work on her first full-length novel, Eleanor and Mary Anne. It was going to be told in the same epistolary style as Lady Susan, with letters. However, in 1797, after some time away from the project, she chose to abandon this style, believing it no longer served the narrative. However, before Austen would get to making this decision surrounding the writing style of Eleanor and Mary Anne, she wrote another book in 9 months titled First Impressions. Her father, a steadfast supporter of his daughter, loved First Impressions. In fact, he loved it so much that he wrote to Thomas Cadell, a London publisher, about getting the book published. Mr. Austen was prepared to publish the book at the author's risk, meaning he'd have to put up the money if necessary, but the inquiry he sent was returned with "declined by return of post" sprawled across it. It's unclear if Jane ever knew of the effort her father went through to get her book published. Now, the thing that is likely clear to anyone about Eleanor and Marianne and First Impressions is that they're not titles you're familiar with when considering Austen's catalog. Following the completion of First Impressions, Austen began revising Eleanor and Marianne, eventually producing a draft closest to what the book would eventually be released as, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Almost immediately after her revisions were completed for Eleanor and Marianne, Austen, on a roll, began writing her third full-length novel in 1798. Initially titled Susan, but later known as Northanger Abbey, Austen completed the novel within a year. With this, several years had seen Austen produce 3 completed novels, though none were published. They were the earliest incarnations of what would become classics in modern literature. Considering the next few years of Jane Austen's life, it's lucky they didn't get lost in the shuffle. For now, they collected dust in boxes, safe and sound. The early 19th century saw big changes in Austen's personal life that had a direct impact on her writing. It was in December of 1800 that her father, George Austen, shocked everyone by announcing his retirement from the ministry. As if that wasn't a big change in and of itself, George felt it was time to uproot the entire family and leave Steventon for Bath in Somerset in the spring of 1801. Jane was 25 at the time and had known nothing beyond her home in Steventon except for brief moments in her childhood when she was at Oxford and Reading. During this time, it's unclear if Jane really achieved much in terms of writing. We know that she worked on a novel titled The Watsons, which she eventually abandoned. However, beyond that, it's unclear if she spent a lot of time revising and reworking old stuff, or if she perhaps didn't write much at all. There are numerous theories surrounding this period of time, including Jane being depressed in Bath and a thriving social life keeping her from writing. But we just don't have records of everything she wrote during this time, making it hard to say how much she actually did. In general, 1801 to 1804 is a period of Jane's life most historians agree is a mystery. From this period, very few letters and records exist helping us understand her life at the time. Instead, we know fragments of information. For example, in 1803, Henry Austen took over the role of Jane's agent and managed to sell her manuscript for Northanger Abbey, then titled Susan, to Richard Crosby's publishing company, receiving £10, which is equivalent to over £600 today. They briefly marketed the book, but in the end, they never published it. This rejection was difficult for Austen to take, considering she'd been so close this time around. Regardless, she continued working on her latest offering, The Watsons. It was also during this time that Austen received her first and only marriage proposal, which she accepted at first. Harris Bigwither proposed in December of 1802. Harris was the brother of Austen's friends, Catherine and Althea, and was considered an unattractive man. Jane was most certainly not in love with Harris, but likely said yes to the proposal for 2 reasons. The first reason was that she was getting older and the prospects of marriage were few for Jane. Secondly, Harris came from a family with money, which would serve Austen well as she hoped to take care of her parents. Despite these reasons, Austen backed out of the proposal the next day. Perhaps the most pivotal moment in the first 5 years of the new century was when George Austen passed away in January 1805. Beyond the heartbreaking aspect of this moment in Jane's life, the truth was it left the 3 Austen women in a precarious position financially. Eventually, they would all move to Southampton to live with Frank Austen and his wife, and it would be years before anything meaningful happened in Jane's life as she spent the next several years visiting relatives and polishing Northanger Abbey, still titled Susan and still unpublished by Crosby and Company. Things simply weren't moving for Austen's career as a writer, but that didn't mean she was throwing in the towel. In 1809, 2 events took place. The first was the Austens' move to Chawton on July 7, 1809. Edward Austen invited his mother and 2 sisters to live with him and his wife in Chawton, where they had a large cottage the 3 could occupy. In April, several months before their move, Jane wrote to Crosby and confronted him about the publishing of Susan, providing a new version of the manuscript she'd recently completed. Crosby responded like a total dick by stating they'd never promised to publish it and were more than happy for her to buy back the publishing rights for what she received, and then she'd be free to find someone else to publish it. Unfortunately for Jane, she didn't have the money to repurchase her book's rights at the time, so she let it be. But things were about to change in some capacity for Jane. During the next few years, Jane Austen revisited some manuscripts from her earlier, more prolific days and reworked them into some of the classics we know. Her book Eleanor Marianne, originally worked on in 1795, became Sense and Sensibility, which was published in 1811 by publisher Thomas Egerton. Jane Austen's biggest crime as a writer was being a woman. The 18th century in England didn't call for women to be ambitious in terms of a career. If they were writing, it was a hobby and were more expected to be mothers. So while Sense and Sensibility was Austen's first published work, it didn't bear her name, instead saying by a woman, which is wow. The initial print run of Sense and Sensibility by a woman did well, and by mid-1813 the book sold out of its first edition run, which was likely 500 books or something. Larger print runs would happen for future editions and Austen titles, as it quickly became apparent that Austen's writing was resonating with audiences. Overall, Austen made £140, equivalent to roughly £8,100 in 2024, from Sense and Sensibility. Her next novel was a reworking of her early draft for First Impressions, which became Pride and Prejudice, published in January 1813. For her second book, she sold the copyright outright for the book, the only book she'd do this for during her publishing career. She sold the rights for £110, equivalent to about £6,375 in 2024. Pride and Prejudice was well advertised, and thanks to Austen's proven success with Sense and Sensibility, her second book did extremely well, both critically and commercially, managing to sell out by October, years ahead of what her first book achieved. This ensured Austen never took this route again, seeing it benefited Egerton far more than it did her. Due to the success of Sense and Sensibility, Austen's subsequent novels published while she was alive were billed as by the author of Sense and Sensibility. Austen's works were also published at the author's financial risk, meaning that if the book didn't recoup its investment, then the author had to pay. This was the case with all of Austen's books published in her lifetime, with the exception of Pride and Prejudice. Austen had proven successful with her first two books, so it was almost expected her third would be yet another hit. In 1814, Mansfield Park was published, and while commercially successful, it was strangely ignored by critics. There's evidence to suggest that when it came to Mansfield Park, Jane and her brother Henry traveled to London to discuss the publishing of the book to avoid the same issues they'd encountered with Pride and Prejudice over the commission. With Austen's growing catalog of novels and popularity, Jane moved her publishing to a more prolific London publisher at the time. This decision didn't come lightly, but instead was the result of Egerton's shortcomings as a publisher and perhaps his lack of respect for Jane as an author. Despite her success in terms of sales, Egerton refused the printing of a second edition of Mansfield Park. Beyond that, it suggested that when Emma was completed by Austen, he delayed and dithered before ultimately bringing an offer unworthy of someone with a proven track record. So with that, Austen took her books to John Murray, agreeing to 10% of the profits and approving a second edition of Mansfield Park. During these tense moments of publishing changes, Jane's brother and manager fell ill and nearly died. Emma was Austen's first brush with a failure. While today Emma ranks as a favorite of the Austen books, it wasn't as appreciated back in 1816 when it was published. The book underperformed in its first edition, and thanks to the underperforming of Mansfield Park's second edition, Austen barely made any money. In the early months of 1816, 41-year-old Jane Austen began feeling unwell, but chose to ignore the warning signs. It didn't take long for Austen to show noticeable signs of deterioration. It's largely unclear what exactly happened to Jane Austen, but the prevailing theory based on all available evidence is that Austen died of Addison's disease. However, it was also noted she likely was suffering from an immune deficiency and fatal lymphoma from as early as January 1813. Several years before she ultimately passed away. During this period of illness, Austen continued writing, working on The Elliots, which later became Persuasion. She also worked on The Brothers, which later became Sanditon. Unfortunately, come roughly mid-March 1817, Austen stopped writing altogether, only having completed 12 chapters. By March 18, 1817, Austen noted she'd stopped writing, not knowing she'd never write again. Over the coming month, her disease progressed rapidly. She began struggling to walk, lacked energy, and eventually found herself confined to her bed. By the time she was taken to Winchester for treatment, she was in agonizing pain and likely knew the odds of survival were low. She welcomed death, and on July 18, 1817, Jane Austen succumbed to her disease, passing away at the young age of 41. Jane Austen's legacy is undeniable. Today, her works have sold more than 30 million copies, have been adapted countless times, and are celebrated worldwide. Austen herself has become a literary legend. Unfortunately, most of this happened after succumbing to her illness in 1817. Even on her tombstone, the epitaph written by her brother James praises Jane but never mentions her writing, at least not explicitly. He writes, "The benevolence of her heart, the sweetness of her temper, and the extraordinary endowments of her mind obtained the regard of all who knew her and the warmest love of her intimate connections." It was the month following Jane's death that her sister Cassandra and brothers Murray and Henry chose to buy the rights back and publish Northanger Abbey along with Persuasion as a set, listing Jane Austen as the author. Initially, her novels went out of print in 1820s England, but the copies that existed in personal libraries sparked a growing fan club for Austen. In 1832, Richard Bentley, a publisher, purchased the copyrights for all of Austen's novels, publishing them as illustrated volumes. Since October 1833, Austen's books have continuously remained in print, meaning they've been in print for 191 years. Nearly 2 centuries of continuous print. The difficult truth of Jane Austen is that we simply don't know for certain what every aspect of her life was like. We have to rely on the retellings of history from family folklore and historians' gatherings. Regardless, it's clear that nearly 2 centuries later, Jane Austen has cemented a legacy she couldn't have even dreamed of back in the 18th or 19th centuries. I hope you learned something today, and if you enjoyed this video, go ahead and deploy your likes, comments, subscribe to the channel if you're not, and share this video with someone who loves learning about historical figures and history. I'm Eric Malachite, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.